Welcome back. You're watching Australian Agenda. We're joined now by the head of the US Studies Centre, the CEO, Professor Bates Gill. Appreciate your time. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Peter.
Let me just ask you straight off the bat, I suppose, what did you make of President Obama's speech yesterday?
Well, I think it was pretty important. Obviously, he wants to, invigorate a little more the notion of America's rebalance to Asia. Great opportunity to do it. Almost 3 years to the day from when he gave his speech in 2011 before the Australian Parliament. And it's maybe pushed back against some of the skepticism about America's wherewithal and willingness to be engaged as deeply as they are. So I think that was sort of the strategic purpose behind it. And he touched on a lot of important issues as well to give some specificity to that. And of course, had the opportunity to touch on some of his favorite issues like climate change, like gender equality, and the like. Democracy in the region was also an important theme. So I think it was quite important speech.
Some of it, though, and Paul Kelly alluded to this in his editorial, looked like a bit of a poke in the eye to our Prime Minister. Firstly, do you agree with that? And secondly, do you think it was intentional?
I wouldn't want to read too much into it. I mean, obviously, Obama's been strong on climate change from the get-go. He's, I think, riding high on the agreement that he was able to get with the Chinese, for example. So clearly, this whole trip was going to be built around climate change. I don't think it was built with the intention of poking the Prime Minister in the eye. I'm sure there was some debate internally about just how strong the President should be on Australian soil on the issue.
But it was interesting because our Prime Minister said that he wants this G20 focus to be the economy, not climate change. He was quite specific about that. Yeah. And the President of the United States gets up and, off the back of having already done a deal with China in terms of targets on climate change, he then launches that as the central focus of his speech. Yeah,
and also took the opportunity to announce this $3 billion fund now to deal with climate change mitigation issues. So I don't think we should read too much into it that this was intended to be a poke in the eye of the Prime Minister, but clearly I'm sure there was some debate internally about how's this going to come off in Australia, and they decided to go with it nonetheless.
How important do you think this agreement is between the United States and China on these new climate change targets, particularly in the context of the Paris conference next year about climate change?
But, in my view, the strategic atmosphere around this agreement is probably the most important outcome. It's telling the world that these two countries, contrary to the conventional narrative, are capable of finding some common ground, some common agreement, and moving forward on issues that matter to both of them rather than being in contention. A lot harder is going to be the devil in the details here because, Obama's only got 2 more years. Xi Jinping himself has only got 8 more years, presumably, at least as an official leader in China. And, the targets are tough. The targets are going to be very tough. If the president is going to have a hard time, I would imagine, through executive order in the next 2 years, getting the sort of measures in place that are going to deliver on a 26 to 28% reduction over 2005 levels. And the Chinese target, in a way, is even more ambitious. I mean, just now, they have only about 5 or 7%, I think is about right, of renewable energy production in China, mostly nuclear, right? I mean, to get to 20% within the next 10 years is going to be extremely difficult for them, not least for their own domestic political issues, because this is coal. China's a coal country, not unlike the United States and Australia. So it's going to be difficult to move down these pathways towards renewable for China. But let's hope they can do so. The big takeaway for me is that this sends a big signal to the international community.
And presumably this will be of significance in terms of what happens in Paris.
It would be, I think. Now, how much influence it's going to have between now and then, a year is a long time. The two countries, U.S. and China, are going to have to keep up the rhetoric, keep up the momentum. What often happens, as you know, after summits is people go back home and go about their business, and a lot of the high talk from the previous days is soon forgotten. So if this is going to have an impact in Paris, which is still a year to go, the two countries are going to have to keep pushing on this and reminding the world that this is their intention to move forward.
What do you make of the fact that they're doing a bilateral deal like this, though? I mean, I find the process almost as interesting, if not more interesting, than what was actually agreed to as a target. That is, the US and China at the APEC forum getting a side together and trying to strike a deal.
Well, again, let's step back here, and I think all of those big announcements that we heard coming out of Beijing last week on climate, There was the deal to lower tariffs on high-tech trade. There's this remarkable deal to offer up 10-year renewable visas to tourists and business persons and students. Remarkable. Why? And as you say, to schedule a standalone state visit on the part of the president with China after the APEC meeting. I think this was very, very carefully calculated over the past year or so on the part of people, both in Washington and Beijing, to try and push back against what's sort of become the conventional narrative about the direction of U.S.-China relations, which is generally seen as very negative and devolving towards conflict.
Well, just on that point, what's your assessment then of the current condition of U.S.-China relations and your assessment of the warning to China given by President Obama in the first part of the speech he gave yesterday? I mean, was that hard? Was that soft? What's the way you'd interpret the nature of that warning?
Well, you'll notice that that sort of language did not come through in Beijing. So I think he was cautious, of course, not to embarrass the Chinese leadership on their own territory. But he, for his own domestic political reasons, has to assure that even though certain important deals are made with Beijing, he can't appear to be rolling over and not pushing back on issues of importance, not least things like human rights and Chinese assertiveness, in the region, as in the South China Sea. So, it wasn't as strong as it could have been, his language here in Australia, the president's. I think there's a strategic hope and even expectation that through continued serious deliberations with the Chinese, by trying to find some common ground, that the relationship can move forward. Very positive outcome, for example, the two countries, another big agreement we haven't mentioned yet that came out of Beijing was the agreement to sort of notify one another before or shortly after major military activities. It's another important step forward. Again, I think it's an effort to demonstrate to the world very seriously that Washington and Beijing want to stabilize their relationship.
Well, on that, I mean, this is a superficial way to put it, but I think a lot of people will be interested in your answer to this. The Cold War, from USSR versus United States days, comparing to the decades to come with the situation between China and the United States. Very different, or elements of similarities in your view?
I don't see very many similarities. The Cold War was truly an existential challenge to the United States and its allies. The threat of nuclear Armageddon was real. We don't face that sort of standoff with China, where China has no bases abroad, China has no serious allies abroad that pose any sort of concern, I would think, to the United States in any serious strategic way. And I would even say the ideological component is also very, very different. I mean, we don't see China exporting its sort of communist or socialist model. And we all know, even the Chinese leaders, I would think, in their own minds, recognize that they're communist, sort of in name only. If anything, we could argue, you could build a decent argument that much of what China is doing globally generally falls within the Western construct of liberal, free trade, market-oriented approaches to the world.
Although it's interesting that you say that, because I'm sure you saw the British Prime Minister's address of the Australian Parliament, where he was looking to draw a bit of a distinction, I suppose, between the capitalism that China pursues versus the realities of the Western democratic principles that countries like Great Britain, the United States and Australia enjoy.
All true, but again, to get back to the differences between what we dealt with the Soviet Union, the Soviet bloc was an almost entirely isolated, non-integrated into the international system. China and its markets, very, very different. I would agree that in many instances they're playing the game slightly differently than us. But the fact that we call it their form of capitalism already differentiates them from what we were dealing with the Soviet Union.
One of the important decisions the Abbott government has recently taken is not to sign up to the China Regional Infrastructure Bank for strategic and security reasons. How strong do you think the pressure was from the United States on the Abbott government, and how important do you think America saw this decision on Australia's behalf?
Well, it's an interesting set of issues here, Paul, because you may have seen recently that there was a document released into the public realm purporting to be the Australian non-paper given to the Chinese, listing a series of highly technical issues around economic and transparency governance questions in relation to the Asian Infrastructure Bank, which leads me to think that in addition to potential strategic concerns about sort of the optics of siding with China on this issue when Washington was clearly not ready to side yet with China, aside from those issues, which I think are important, there were real technical governance questions at play. Now, in terms of the Washington-Canberra dynamic on this, I have no insight on this, except I do think that there were serious concerns within the White House about the image of a close ally moving in and joining up on with this, the AIIB, without really having a clear picture yet about how this bank's going to operate, what sort of impact it's truly going to have, the degree of control that China is going to exercise over how those monies are invested. And I think there was a bit of pressure, and we saw as much with John Kerry's discussions with the Prime Minister in Jakarta, etc.
Okay, well, there was some pressure. Let me put the question a slightly different way. Do you think if Australia had decided to sign up to the bank, that would have had any downside in terms of relations with the United States?
I suspect perhaps in the near term, but not in any serious long-term way. I mean, I myself, for what it's worth, had thought that it would have been a good idea for Australia to join.
Why is that?
Well, just under the thinking that better to be inside the tent at the beginning and be able to have some impact and influence upon its direction. On reflection and having seen this non-paper and recognizing that there are a long list of pretty serious technical concerns, maybe at the end of the day this was the right decision, and the door is still open now for Australia to join it at some point.
Before we run out of time, I want to ask you about the strength or otherwise of the so-called US pivot towards Asia. It was touched on again by the United States President. It seems to have been reinforced. How real is it?
I'm a big believer in it, and I think the problem that outside observers have is that much of this is relatively quiet or outside of the realm of day-to-day news. And the important thing that I think the President tried to underscore yesterday as well is that it's not just in sort of military-related aspects. I mean, clearly, it is just so clearly in the interest of the United States to be more deeply engaged in such an important and dynamic region. It just makes complete sense. And it's going to be a quite natural effort on the part of the United States to be more engaged here. But you look at not just in Australia, but increased military relationships with countries like the Philippines, the decision to open up arms exports to Vietnam most recently, basing of ships in Singapore. That's very important. And I think on trade and on diplomatic relationships as well, this is a serious strategy. What's going to be interesting is to see, after 2 years when we have a new president in the White House who will not want to use the same language, whether that person is a Republican or a Democrat, to see how that person then assures that this engagement in the region continues. And
just finally, very quickly, your thoughts on the results from the recent midterms and what, if any, implication that might have for the next US presidential contest?
Well, I guess I would not read if I were a Republican, I'd try not to read too much into the results because obviously part of the capacity of the next candidate to succeed is going to be how the party is viewed in these next 2 years. At the national level, the Republicans still have a very serious uphill battle to put in place a candidate that's going to be attractive and who can win. And of course, they're going to go through a bruising primary season where we'll see the divisions within the Republican Party revealed once again. So it's still tough going.
Professor Bates Gill from the US Study Centre, the head of the US Study Centre at Sydney University, thanks very much for your time.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you, Paul.
Stay with us here on